This video lecture will discuss Chapter 10 of Film Studies, Genre. Genre is a type or category of film that has its own recognizable conventions and character types. They rely on recognizable conventions rather than inventions. Some of the genres are action film, beach party picture, gangster picture, western film, slapstick comedy, costume drama, martial arts film, baseball picture, drama, melodrama, sci-fi film, women's prison picture, horror film, the thriller, and the chick flick. Within each larger genre, there is also a set of subgenres. A subgenre is a smaller category within a genre category. Some examples of horror subgenres are the monster movie. An example would be Frankenstein, the monster as psychotic human, which we can see in Silence of the Lambs, the splatter film. An example would be The Evil Dead, Japanese horror, as we see with the film The Cure, and horror comedy, which we can see in the film Shaun of the Dead. A convention is a widely used and accepted device in an art form, commonly accepted and understood in a given culture, while a variation is a dissimilarity from other films in the same genre or subgenre. The horror film. Noel Carroll said, "The question is, why would anyone be interested in the genre to begin with? Why does the genre persist? How can we explain its very existence, for why would anyone want to be horrified?" Horror films are known for their reliance on convention rather than variation. Despite that reliance on convention, horror films never fail to capture an audience. The American horror film has a rich history, with more classic examples of horror films being Dracula, Psycho, Halloween, Rosemary's Baby, Night of the Living Dead, Poltergeist, The Exorcist, and Jaws, and more recent examples being The Conjuring, The Blair Witch Project, The Haunting, The Ring, Zombieland, and Scream. What is the difference? What appears to demarcate the horror story from mere stories with monsters, such as myths, is the attitude of characters in the story to the monsters they encounter. In works of horror, the humans regard the monsters they meet as abnormal, as disturbances of the natural order. In fairy tales, on the other hand, monsters are part of the everyday furniture of the universe. Within the genre of horror, there are two very distinct narrative structures described by Noel Carroll. The first is the complex discovery plot. There are 4 different stages to this narrative structure. In the onset stage, the audience becomes aware of the creature, or the monster. In the discovery stage, the individual or group of characters learn of the monster's existence. In the confirmation stage, skeptics are convinced that the monster is real. And then finally, in the confrontation stage, humanity marches out to meet the monster. In the film Paranormal Activity, we can see these 4 different stages played out on screen. Katie, the main character, is tired in the beginning of the film. She becomes convinced that a spirit is haunting her. In the discovery stage, her boyfriend helps Katie set up a camera and they begin filming her at night. They start to notice strange occurrences and disturbances. The confirmation stage is when the psychic comes in and confirms that a spirit is indeed haunting Katie. The psychic warns that they should stop using the camera or trying to contact the spirit because it will make the spirit stronger, but Katie's boyfriend doesn't listen. In the confrontation stage, the boyfriend continues to do things that provoke the spirit, the first of which is setting up a Ouija board to contact the spirit and set up a line of communication. As a result, the spirit becomes more and more aggressive until it takes over Katie's body, kills her boyfriend, and leaves at the end of the film. The second common narrative structure is the overreacher plot. The overreacher plot is featured in many different films where we can see a scientific experiment gone wrong. There are 4 different stages to the overreacher plot. The first stage is the preparation for the experiment. The second one is the experiment itself. The third stage is when the experiment goes awry. And then the final stage is the confrontation with the monster. We can see these stages played out in the story of Frankenstein. In the beginning of the film, we see Dr. Frankenstein's plans for his experiment. Then we see Dr. Frankenstein assembling his monster, and when we see the monster come alive, we're seeing the experiment itself. The experiment, though, then goes awry. The monster starts killing people. The first victim is an accident, but then the killing becomes intentional. And then the final stage is the confrontation between Dr. Frankenstein and his creation. Characters are a very significant part of the horror film genre. Within a horror narrative, there are 4 main types of characters. The first is a hero. The hero is the protagonist and fights the villain. We can see an example of the hero in the film The Conjuring with the 2 characters Lorraine and Ed Warren, who try to help a family get rid of an evil spirit. The second type of character is the victim or group of victims. These can also be the protagonists. They are often immoral teenagers or beautiful, and often stupid, young women. An example of the victim is Casey. She is a teenage girl who is alone and then becomes the first victim in the first scene of the film Scream. The villain is the antagonist. The villain embodies the forces of evil and can take the form of vampires, zombies, ghosts, demons, clowns, possessed toys, or other scary creatures. An example of the villain is Pennywise from the film It. Pennywise is a clown, but he can also take the form of children's greatest fears and shift his shape as he needs to. The fourth character type is the police or the helpful authority. The helpful authority offers assistance and may be good or evil. An example of the police or helpful authority is Dewey. He is the local cop who attempts to find the killer in the film Scream. Within these broader types, we also have more specific character types. These character types appear in the order in which they are killed off in the film. We begin with the whore, then the monster claims the fool, then the scholar, then the athlete, and then finally the virgin is the only one left standing. The monster. The monster in a horror film is both threatening and impure or disgusting. According to Carroll, monsters can be broken down into 4 different category types. The first is interstitial, which means an uncanny combination of the normal and the abnormal. Monsters can also be contradictory. Many monsters of the horror genre are interstitial and/or contradictory in terms of being both living and dead. For example, ghosts, zombies, vampires, mummies, or the Frankenstein monster. Near relatives of these are monstrous entities that conflate the animate and the inanimate, such as haunted houses with malevolent wills of their own, robots, or even the car in Stephen King's film Christine. Also, many monsters confound different species, such as werewolves, humanoid insects, or humanoid reptiles. Monsters can also be incomplete. Categorical incompleteness is also a standard feature of the monsters of horror. Ghosts and zombies frequently come without eyes, arms, legs, or skin, or they are in some advanced state of disintegration. And In a related vein, detached body parts are serviceable monsters, such as severed heads and especially hands. The monster can also be formless. An example of an interstitial monster is the werewolf from An American Werewolf in London. Contradictory monsters come in the form of flesh-eating zombies who are both living and dead, from the film Night of the Living Dead. An incomplete monster comes in the form of the Headless Horseman, who claims his victims by chopping off their heads. And finally, a formless monster comes in the form of the Blob from the film The Blob. The Blob is a mass that comes from a meteorite and begins to suck up its victims, growing larger with each kill. In the horror film, the monster must be dangerous physically, and it is often, but not always, also dangerous psychologically. Building suspense. A key in the horror genre is to build suspense for the audience. The basic narrative connection in the horror story is the question-answer format. Will the monster be discovered? Can the monster be destroyed? Will the characters convince the authorities that the monster exists and that the danger is real? It is these questions that keep the narrative moving forward and that create suspense for the viewer. Monsters are irredeemably evil, immensely powerful, and shrouded in secrecy, which gives them the upper hand, making it unlikely that our protagonists will survive. That is why we, as an audience, keep watching. Settings are another important part of the horror genre. Settings come in the form of hospitals, insane asylums, mental institutions, or hotels, with long hallways and many rooms, as we can see in the hotel from the famous film The Shining. The setting may also be a graveyard or a cemetery, as we can see in the graveyard from the Night of the Living Dead. This is the opening scene where Barbara, the main character, and her brother are attacked by zombies. Another common setting is a church or a convent. In the beginning of the 1991 version of Dracula, we see Dracula in front of an altar where he drinks blood and is transformed into a vampire. An isolated community or remote location, such as a cabin, abandoned mansion, haunted house, ghost town, farm field, dark woods, or tunnels, can also be a setting in a horror film. We can see this setting in the film The Conjuring. This is a remote haunted house in Rhode Island. And finally, we can see the setting in basements, attics, or even science labs. This is the attic from the film The Grudge, where one of the characters discovers a dead body. Iconography and props. In many horror films, the events take place in dark settings, and the characters often wear dark clothes or costumes, such as Dracula's dark cape. Religious or demonic symbolism appears frequently. This is Damien's scalp, with the number 666 from the film The Omen. There are often stabbing weapons, such as knives, axes, or chainsaws. Rarely are the weapons guns. This is the famous chainsaw from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There is always a great deal of blood, as we can see the pig's blood from the final scene in the film Carrie. And the villains often wear masks. The audience may also see mirrors or even peepholes. The infamous mask from Scream, Friday the 13th, and Halloween all hide the identities of the killers. Cinematography is an important aspect of the horror genre. Unnatural camera angles, such as canted angle, low angle, and high angle shots, are often used to create impressions of power and submission or fear. Extreme close-ups of victims allow us, the audience, to see the terror on the victims' faces. Long takes with sudden jump cuts are used to shock the viewer. Point of view shots, from the perspective of the villain, allow us to see the victims as the villain is stalking them. We often see shallow depth of field, where the protagonist or the victim is in focus, but the background is blurry. And handheld shots are also used frequently. Handheld shots create a realistic impression infused with terror. Sound effects are also very important in horror films. Ambient diegetic sounds, such as footsteps, breathing, or the sound of a chainsaw, can be heard. Silence is often used to build the tension and increase suspense in the film. Themes and motifs. Some common themes and motifs that show up across many different horror films are good versus evil, nightmares, madness, and insanity, childhood fears and issues, revenge, dangers of science, dark versus light, religion and demonic power, transgression and morality, and fear of the unknown. Now it's time for some independent work. Take notes on The Cabin in the Woods. How does this film demonstrate the conventions of the horror genre? Consider characters, narrative, settings, suspense, iconography and props, cinematography, sound effects, and themes or motifs. Also consider the monster and the type of monster that you see in the film. Be prepared to discuss your notes in class.